Last week we saw right-wing extremists, terrorists storm the halls of Congress. Yesterday we saw the president impeached for the second time. Next week we're going to see the inauguration of a new president. So it's a pretty historic time, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. I guess I want to give you both just a little time at the start to think about this and talk about how you're processing this moment. I'll go to you first, Jill. How exactly are you thinking about the moment that we're in right now?
I think this is a moment where everyone is a historian. In ordinary times, have a sense of living on a timeline, and I evaluate what's going on day to day in the context of previous events. But I think everyone now routinely does that. So there's a weird collapse between historians and non-historians. And like everyone else, I feel like my head is just spinning around and around. It's impossible to keep up with the pace of events. Although I had an experience today that somewhat speaks to this, though. I've been revising my book, These Truths: History of the United States, for turning it into a college textbook, and I happen to be revising the chapter that involves the election and inauguration of Thomas Jefferson, of the election of 1800. He's inaugurated in 1801. It's a contested election, and it's the first transfer of power from one political party to the other in the history of the United States. And it's expected to lead to civil war. Many people think that there'll be violence on the streets, and it doesn't. And in my previous version of the account, I talk about the first peaceful transfer of power that would be an American tradition and provide stability to the American Republic through many decades of atrocity and blundering and heroism and all manner of events. And I had to add in the revision that tradition ended in 2021 with the storming of the Capitol, and it was an eerie and an anguished moment as a matter of revision.
Historians generally have the luxury of waiting until the last out in the ninth inning and then saying, I think the Yankees are going to win. We like to take the long view of things and see, what the dynamics are, what, are the things that are the various threads that are woven into any one moment and have the clarity that deliberation presents. And so it's really overwhelming. Thinking about all these things is really, I think, overwhelming, especially if you're looking at them in the long view, because there's so many of these questions that pop up and connect to other narrative points in American history and questions that are yet unresolved and so on. And, I'm glad that Jill made the point about the first transfer of power between parties in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson was elected. It's a very interesting point. We now we attribute the stability of our democracy to the two-party system. But when you go back to the founders and read, what they wrote, they were convinced, at the outset, the ratification of the Constitution, they were convinced that the last thing that this society could endure were political parties. So much so that in his farewell address, George Washington, specifically when he lists the things that he thinks could be really detrimental to the society, he says partisanship. Well, he doesn't use the language that we would use now, but he talks about factions, which are effectively what we would call parties now. And he says that, and the idea of people having regional allegiances as opposed to national ones could wind up ruining this entire undertaking. And so we wind up coming back to those kinds of questions, the fundamental questions. We're not dealing with really evolved or brand new concepts. We're grappling with fundamental questions, things that kind of came up at the beginning, at the outset of the creation of the country.